Our next speaker is, I had a wonderful conversation with this gentleman. He is product management director on PTC's Wind Chill product analytics team, and he's responsible for the life cycle assessment module. He has a background in ecological footprinting and environmental input-output analysis. Prior to joining the company, he managed an enterprise networking product line at Cisco, and in our private phone conversation, he admitted to me, as happens to often many of us, that passions changed as his interest in the environmental movement came along. He then became a founding member of DriveNeutral.org, an organization that offsets carbon emissions. He's on the board of the Presidio School of Management, earned his master's in electrical engineering, and achieved an MBA in sustainable management from the Presidio School of Management. I believe he was the second class to graduate from that, and now has the wonderful opportunity to work from his own home office, as do I. His surfing has suffered, but he gets to bike up Mount Tampa several times a week. Would you please help me welcome Jergen Vos, Sustainability Manager at PTC. Jergen Vos.
Thanks, Ken. And yeah, the reason my surfing has suffered is that we actually were acquired, the team I'm with was acquired by PTC early last year. We had an office in San Bruno, just south of San Francisco. So my commute would take me past the beach, and I could check the waves before getting into work and decide whether I would start working or start surfing first. What I'll be talking about, actually, it sort of extends Terry's talk to a certain extent, and I don't have too many pretty pictures. They're a bit corporate marketing-like pictures to some extent, so excuse me for that. I'll be talking about trying to actually scale LCA, the use of LCA in organizations. And just to be upfront in the market segment I will be talking about, we don't do anything with buildings within PTC. It's mostly goods that, say, move or have many parts in them. It's vehicles, it's airplanes, it's cell phones, very little retail footwear and apparel that you see here. So when you talk about LCA, you often get questions about, say, a consumer good. Typically, we're not in that market segment, and we're also not in building segment. So just to be upfront with some of the context maybe that I'll be talking about. We stole this image from Stephen Stokes from AMR. I think AMR is now Gartner. And they talked about the evolution of organizations when they grow from being a reactive organization that just does things because they have to, toward becoming more an organization that's aware of sustainability, or that's even becoming strategic about it. And Wind Chill product analytics, for those of you who have been to this symposium in the last couple of years, you may have seen John Fox speak from PTC. He was talking about a product called Insight, talking about environmental compliance. And Wind Chill product analytics is the evolution of Insight, so just to put that into perspective. And with that product line, what we actually can see is that we do see customers starting to begin at the left end, at the reactive side, saying, I need to manage restricted substances. For those of you familiar with the ROS regulation in Europe, there's a ROS recast going on right now, which means that many organizations, if they don't have their restricted substances management in order, may lose their CE mark on their products this year. So that's panic. You need to have a system in place. You need to start doing something. So it's reactive mode in order to even be able to say, oh, no, we've got green products here just because you're meeting the law. And when companies become more aware of sustainability, typically the first thing that they see is that sustainability helps them reduce cost. So they see they're using too much of certain types of materials. They're not efficient with the energy they use. They can switch out light bulbs. They start to essentially drive cost out of the organization because they recognize that, hey, the sustainability thing actually makes sense in terms of being more profitable. But then when they're becoming more strategic, that's when we really see LCA coming into play. And that's where we see that companies are looking at not reducing the bottom line cost impact, but really trying to increase their profits, maybe position their companies differently, and try to capture more market share by delivering greener products. And that's where we see that lifecycle analytics is being used. And like Terry said early on, 80% or so, or some high number percentage of a product's impacts really are designed in early in the design stage. It's I attribute it to an ancient LCA wisdom. I guess we'll never know who actually gave us the number or the insight, but it's a general truth, and it's a general truth often even for cost of a product. It's a general truth for hazardous materials that are in a product. So being able to actually take a product design and analyze it very early in the cycle, which means that you have to have the proper people doing that analysis, that's the key focus that we're in. And that's also what's driving our LCA approach. A lot of my inspiration I actually have stolen from Toshiba. I don't know if you can steal inspiration. No, I don't think you can steal inspiration. But several of the things that I've been talking about for a few years now actually came from getting my hands on the Toshiba environmental report. And it's actually a great thing to look at when you're into product design. And in their case, they do things from small cell phones up to trains, if you will, and anything in between. And in their environmental impact report, they give profiles for all of their different products. And here's just a few samples of them. And they show you how different products have a very different impact profile. For example, a basic cell phone without a charge, just the very basic cell phone, most of the life cycle impact is the use of materials. If you take a vacuum cleaner, you have some material impact, you have some manufacturing impact, you have some use phase impact, so the use of electricity. If you have an air conditioner, you're really talking about mostly use phase impacts. Materials is somewhat there, but if you're designing a next generation air conditioner, you could even say, who cares the material impact? Maybe I should double my material impact if I can have this really big chunk of energy use impact. So different types of products actually require different approaches, is what you're finding there. Now within industry, and even Toshiba is not at a place where they've got this down to a system where everybody's integrated with it. Typically what we're seeing in the industry is that the vast majority of companies are laggards, if you will. May have heard of LCA, probably haven't done much or anything with it. The vast majority of companies that do something with LCA are here somewhere in the middle. They've got this one lone expert, maybe two lone experts, trying to serve the entire company. It's a fairly isolated function, typically doing LCAs on products that are already coming out of design. I was with one of the major European cell phone companies last year, and like many other companies, they had one person responsible for LCA, and she did a few of the phones after design just before they came to market. I asked her, so what would it take to do an LCA for every single phone that you're bringing to market? That would be about 20 people. Now, think next step, you're actually designing the phone and you have design iterations. How many people would it then take to actually do LCAs for every phone while still in design? You can imagine that you need 50 people, maybe in that case. So that's a real scaling problem, and that's a scaling problem that we're actually trying to address with what we're doing with Winchi LCA, where you really have this group of people here with maybe a few experts that really understand the background data, but a lot of the things that you want to do if you have, say, if you're building 200 types of cell phones a year, there's a lot of repetitive work in there. So the repetitive work could actually be done by people that are not necessarily experts or highly skilled in LCA. As long as they're supervised by somebody who's more skilled, as long as the data they have come from people who are very skilled. So that's really the focus of the product that I'm responsible for. We're releasing it this summer. It was actually announced last year. I will not go too much into detail of feature and functionality. You can look that up on the website, but it's really the last bullet point is always my important bullet point here: scale existing in-house LCA efforts. Typically, the companies we work with have an expert in-house. If they don't, very often we say, go deep with your first project. Get some institutional knowledge in-house, then come back and then think about taking this next step. And that's really about being able to take the next step and turning it into a process. Like Terry said, you need to be able to make it part of the process where your engineer, as part of their workflow, can do something that then generates some sort of insight. And where we see a very high benefit of actually tying our product with our environmental compliance product is that one of the most difficult aspects and most time-consuming aspects of LCA is actually getting the data. Anybody who's doing an LCA project probably is 80 to 90% of their time is just trying to get the data from wherever they need to get the data from. If you're building products that are made out of parts that you purchase somewhere, and maybe you use the same part in various of your designs, or various of your parts are just versions of the same thing with the same materials in them, the companies that already have a compliance process in place will already have a way of querying their vendors for what's actually in these parts. How did you make it? What are the substances in there? And in the compliance industry, we've been asking for supplier parts. So the hierarchy here is bill of material. In this case, the example is a phone. Product is made out of what we call company parts, so things that we know by a certain part number. And a company part can be one of multiple supplier parts. Say you have two vendors for the same part and they're interchangeable. You can use one or the other. And typically for compliance, what you go and you ask your supplier about the substances and the amounts of those substances that are living within those parts. And if you're doing a full material request of those suppliers, what they're also telling you is what are the materials that are in there. Now, we never used that in the compliance world. In the compliance legislation, you're always only interested really in the substances. But you sort of get that materials information for free if you have the ability to ask the right question. And that's the information that we want to reuse for LCA. Because substances really is at a level where we don't have good LCA data at most of the gas, chemical, substance level. But we do have it at a material level quite often. So what we then do is we get that information in, we translate it into something we call a company material, sort of a humanized version of the scientific list of all the possible materials that you could have in an LCA database, make it something that your users in your organization actually recognize and understand what it is. And that's the material names that you work with and then tie to wherever our LCA reference data comes from. Now, what's critical is to actually have supplier tools available. A lot of the industry that works in this space is very focused on the OEMs, the people who actually build the cell phones, because they're the ones who can afford our tools. They're the ones who can spend a few $1 million on a project, if you will, to really get that whole system into place, and they have workflows in place where they can engage all of their engineers. But you need to get your answers from those suppliers, and making it easy for those suppliers to actually answer your questions is still a very difficult task. One thing that helps is the IPC 1752 series, or I should say the IPC 1752 standard. For those of you not in the electronics industry. You may not have heard of it, but IPC 1752 is coming out of the Printed Circuit Board Manufacturers Association, and they created a standard communication form, if you will, to query suppliers for hazardous substances. But the form is very generic to a certain extent and can be reused in many industries. So various of our customers in different industries are looking at using it. I'm responsible for a tool called 1752builder.com, sort of a little skunkworks project where I'm personally responsible for and trying to make it usable really for the small user. And those kind of tools and having the forms in place enables our customers to actually get the responses for what's in my parts. So this graph here is an example by APC. They went from having a very hard time getting even up to 5% of their data material content out of their parts suppliers, from building a system and using these forms for asking their suppliers questions and getting up to, say, 70-80% of response rate and good information about what's in the parts that they're purchasing. And that helped them scale, essentially. With the same few people, they got much more data and were able to much more rapidly assess their products. Now, what this assumes in terms of LCA is that, okay, we have a scaling process that we now have in place, but we still need the LCA experts. Because scaling you can do with something that you can repeat, but the LCA expert needs to generate the original data and needs to fill in the data gaps. But then those people that can then focus on filling data gaps and doing original research, they can then put those data points that they generate into the scaling system so that then the engineers who don't need to be experts can use that information and essentially avoid those 20 to 50 people scaling problems in the organization. So final slide is then that, okay, you have your compliance information, you have your LCA information. Now you need to marry that with customer value information, and that's again where I point back to Toshiba. In their case, their factor T is you really want to say, I want to build a better, greener product, but it also means that your customer will want to buy it or has to want to buy it, and it means that you actually have to be competitive with that product as well. And tying customer value to environmental performance is really the way forward, and also the way forward to have your CXOs go and say, okay, I want all of my product in my entire portfolio to be twice as good 5 years from now, and provides you actually with a measuring system of tracking that and various organizational groups to report on how I'm actually doing on these strategies. So, that's
wonderful.
It.
Thank you, Jorgen.
Part replacement or analysis goes on after the product's been designed? So outside
No.
of Pro Engineer and in Windchill, or would this actually occur in Pro Engineer if you were in a
It's
PPC?
actually during the process. Typically, while the designers, say a Pro Engineer or a SolidWorks or whatever, when they're designing a new product, the design lives in Windchill. And the moment it's there, you can start analyzing it. So it should be really integral to the process.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, we just introduced Eco Material Advisor into Inventor, and it's going to be interesting to see the impact, because they now are going to be able to take a look at the impact of that particular part, right? But then the question becomes, are they really going to swap out a known vendor, known part, known simulation results for an unknown part that might have a better, carbon footprint or use less water from an unknown vendor?
True.
Right, and what's the impact going to be of the design cycle?
True.
We're giving it to them.
Yeah.
We're going to see, how they use it. But
For us, it's the same. We know that the system needs to be in place, the scalability needs to be in place, and now we all need to learn with our customers how it's actually going to work.
Going to be used.
Because
Because it has a profound impact potentially. I mean, here you have this lowly engineer. He needs to get his job done. And now is he going to really introduce risk? Let's say it's the same price. Let's say it's the same cost. Mm-hmm. But it has a better water footprint or something, but from a different vendor, right? What's going to happen if that the supply chain gets affected.
True.
And are those kind of analyses in your tool now? Is there some kind of real-time update that the engineer would get about, supply chain cost, availability?
Some elements are in there. Various of them we will learn as we go along.
Yeah.
I see a trajectory of learning in the next couple of years.
Exactly. It's an exciting time.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, I know we have one more question in the back. We'll just take one more.
My question is in the realm of standards. What I wanted to know is what standards initiatives are there out there other than, say, IPC 1752? Are these standards initiatives driven by software developers, by consumers, by industry? And does PTC participate in these? And related to this, what has been your experience in working with competitors in this realm? Are competitors friendly about allowing or working with their competitors in this area? Or are we having a repeat of the problem with PLM and PDM and CAD where the competitors have essentially frozen each other out and use interoperability as a tool to lock in customers?
Very good question. In terms of, say, 1752 as a standard, that a very open collaboration, and I actually was at the biannual, at least semi-annual, standards meeting yesterday in Las Vegas. And it's a very open, it's a mix of OEMs and software vendors trying to make the standard work. It's all about just making sure that the information can flow. LCA isn't part of it yet, and actually Terry and I have been talking, and I've been talking with PE International, so we can see them as sort of collaborators, sometimes competitors for some of the same deals, if you will. But within the LCA space itself, I think we're very open to collaboration still at this point. Because we have the same need of first actually generating data before we need to start competing too much against each other about what the tools do, because the gap is really in the data. There's so much work to be done. The pie has still got to grow so much that worrying about competition right now is the wrong time to do it.
Very good. And on that note,